We're up to the fourth passage. Let's read the blurb. It says, this passage is adapted from Jonah Berger, Contagious, Why Things Catch On, 2013, by Social Dynamics Group, LLC. So initially when I'm reading this, if I hear the expression why things catch on, automatically it makes me think of trends, maybe in fashion or music or television or cultural trends. This passage is actually not about that, as we'll see in the first paragraph, because the first paragraph talks about, in general, how geography matters in voting, but, line 3, few people would think that the exact venue in which they vote matters. And the claim is, in line 5, that it does. So by venue, they mean its specific location. And then the next paragraph, they're going to talk about what the general assumptions of voting is. So line 6, it says, political scientists usually assume that voting is based on rational and stable preferences. Specifically, that means people possess core beliefs and weigh costs and benefits when deciding to vote. So that's the assumption, and then they give some examples such as the environment or healthcare, and they call this, line 14, a cognitive model of voting behavior, because basically cognitive has to do with the way you think. So if they're talking about core beliefs and values, and then you weigh costs and benefits, that's mostly an intellectual process. And in line 15, it says the particular kind of building people happen to cast their ballot in should not affect behavior. In other words, if people are basing their decisions on their values and their thought processes, then obviously the building that they work in should not affect behavior. But it says in line 17, we weren't so sure. So you know that they're going to question this assumption. And they tell us in general about how voting works in the US. It says most people in the US are assigned to vote at a particular polling location. So it's not your choice where to go to vote. Now, what's the specific point they're making about each of these locations or each of these venues? In line 23, it says different locations contain different triggers. So what are triggers? Generally things that make you think about things. So they give examples. Churches have religious imagery, which remind people of church doctrine. Schools are filled with lockers, desks, and that might remind people of their own educational experiences. Why is that important? Because it says in line 28, once these thoughts are triggered, they might change behavior. So the question that they're going to ask is right here, could voting in a school lead people to support educational funding? So this is going to be their research question. And then, like most sociological passages in the SAT, they're going to go into the experiment. So who's involved? Mark Meredith is one person, Christian Wheeler is another person, in case they mention them again, and the author herself. So what do? They basically acquired data from each polling place in Arizona's 2000 general election. So it says they use the addresses to determine the location and the type of building. 40% of people were voting in churches, 26% in schools, 10% in community centers, and the rest in these random places. So then they have to test out their question. So it says in line 40, we examine whether people voted differently at different types of polling places. And now they're going to focus on a specific issue. We focused on the ballot initiative that proposed raising the sales tax from 5.0 to 5.6% to support public schools. Now in the US, typically property taxes, the money generated from property taxes goes directly to schools. So the type of neighborhood that you live in generally determines the quality of the schools and how much money they have. In this particular example, it seems like sales tax is going to somehow support the public schools, possibly by just giving them more money. I'm not 100% sure, but that's the main point. And then it says, line 48, if where people voted didn't matter, then the percent supporting the initiative should be the same at schools and at other polling locations. And that makes sense, because if the specific environment or location is not going to affect your voting choice, then there should be generally the same percentage of people who vote for or against the initiative, whether they voted in a school, whether they voted in a library, whether they voted in a church. So that's all they're saying here. But now they're going to talk about the results. In line 51, it says it wasn't. In other words, the percent was not the same. It says more than 10,000 more people voted in favor of the school funding initiative when the polling place was a school. So it does seem that there's a relationship between the location and the voting behavior that they observed. And the result was the initiative passed. Now, the next paragraph, what they're going to do is they're going to talk about trying to rule out other factors or other variables. And this is generally something that you have to do in any sort of statistical analysis. You have to account for other factors or other variables that could have swayed the results. So it says line 56, the difference persisted, in other words, more people voting for the initiative in schools, even after we controlled for things like regional differences in political preferences and demographics. And then they got even more specific by saying they compared two similar groups, people who live near schools and were assigned to vote at one versus people who live near schools but were assigned to vote at a different type of polling place. Because they're thinking, hey, maybe it's not the exact polling place that determined their vote. Maybe people who lived near schools, that's what influenced their decision. But as they say, the difference persisted, line 63, a higher percentage of the people who voted in schools were in favor of increasing funding for schools. The fact that they were in a school when they voted triggered more school-friendly behavior. And then the last paragraph, they're going to reflect a little bit. It says line 68, a 10,000 vote difference might not seem like much, but it was more than enough to shift a close election. And they give the example of 2000 presidential election between Bush and Al Gore came down to less than 1,000 votes. What's the point of mentioning this? They say if 1,000 votes is enough to shift an election, 10,000 certainly could. So if you know anything about American politics, I believe the difference between Bush and Gore came down to 1,000 votes in Florida. And the reason it was significant is because Florida is usually a swing state. So if the majority of votes on the popular vote went to one or the other candidates, they essentially get all the electoral votes. And that has to do with the Electoral College and how that works in America. All they're really saying here is that even though we're thinking about small numbers can make a big difference in terms of outcomes. That's the main point of this paragraph. So we can probably annotate this passage relatively quickly. The first paragraph introduces the topic, and that's basically the relationship between venue or location and voting behavior. The next paragraph talks about the cognitive model of voting behavior, and this is generally what everyone assumes. The paragraph after that questions the cognitive model, basically says they weren't so sure about that, and then they give some background. And then what is it about the particular location? Here they're arguing in the next paragraph that different locations lead to different triggers, and different triggers will lead to different behavior. So that's the relationship. In the next paragraph, they start to talk about the specific study that they did, and this is basically, it seems like a statistical study. And then they talk about some of their methods, like they do in most scientific passages. And then in lines 51 to 54, they actually talk about the results of their study. And then lines 56 to 67, they talk about eliminating confounding variables. So this is basically how they controlled their experiment. And then the last paragraph, it's sort of a reflection, but it's also talking about why these results are significant. So I'm just going to write significance. And it's using one example, namely the 2000 presidential election. Question 31, which statement best expresses the main idea of the passage? So questions like this, your annotations are really going to help out because you can kind of give the passage a bird's eye view. So what happened, we talked about this idea that location might affect voting behavior, and that goes against how people traditionally understand it. Then they did this study, and the results showed that the place where people voted actually did affect people's voting behavior, namely the fact that more people who voted in schools actually were in favor of that initiative to increase the sales tax, which would actually support schools. So keeping that in mind, let's go through the answer choices. A, the outcome of the elections can often be attributed to geographic variations in the voters' values. So this was one of the controls, or one of the other variables that they controlled for. So if you go back to this paragraph, it says on 56, the difference persisted even after we controlled for things like regional differences in political preferences and demographics. So geographic variations is pretty much the same as regional differences. So the point here is that the results still stayed true. People who voted in schools still supported that increase in sales tax no matter where they lived. That's what they mean by controlling for it. Choice B, politicians exploit the triggering effects of voting venues to better their chances in elections. The passage didn't actually tell us why or how people are assigned to different locations. It basically just made the statement that they were. So there's no evidence that politicians are purposefully using this to their advantage. So B is going to be out. Choice C, voters' attitudes towards education funding are affected by the proximity, that's the nearness or the closeness, of voters' homes to schools. So this is another possible variable that they controlled for. If you look over here, it says line 58. We even compare two similar groups of voters to double check our findings. People who live near schools and were assigned to vote at one versus people who live near schools but were assigned to vote at a different type of polling place. And then what were the results? A higher percentage of the people who voted in schools were in favor of increasing the funding for schools. So what does that mean? It means where they voted was more important than where they lived. So choice C is going to be out. Choice D, voting decisions can be influenced by the surroundings in which voters cast their ballots. So yeah, using the phrase the surroundings, that's just another way to say the physical location that they're in, which the passage talked about, churches, schools, blah, blah, blah. Notice how they're just rewording this. When you read surroundings, you're supposed to think of the initial or the immediate physical location because that's what creates those triggers. So out of all the answer choices, D is going to be the best. Question 32, as used in line 3, exact most nearly means. So let's look at it. Start from line 1. Although geography clearly matters in voting, the East Coast leans Democratic while the South skews Republican. Few people would think the exact venue in which they vote matters. So venue, we said, was location. And notice what the paragraph is doing. We're starting off broad because we're talking about geography in terms of, these big regions in the US, East Coast versus South, to smaller differences. So the best guess word, in my opinion, would be something like the precise venue or the specific venue, because they're going to start talking about the actual building. So let's look at it and keep in mind exact is describing the venue and our guess words were precise or specific. So number 1, particular. Yeah, particular does mean precise or specific, and that works for it's the particular venue or the particular location. So we'll keep that around. The accurate venue. So we're not talking about accuracy in terms of whether something is right versus wrong, like when you aim a gun, whether you hit your target is accurate or not. We're talking about going from a broad geographical area to a very small location within that area. So B, not exactly. C, identical venue. That doesn't make sense for what the sentence is saying, because identical would imply that you're comparing two venues which are exactly the same. Their main point is just saying, hey, it's the specific or it's the exact location that matters. They're not saying that location has to be identical to something else. Proper is also improper as a word, because if you're saying the proper venue, that implies that certain venues are proper and certain venues are improper. So the argument is not that one is right versus wrong. The argument is, in that paragraph, we're talking about a level of specificity. That exact location is going to be significant. If you wanted to go even further, you could say something like maybe the exact position or the exact location within that building that you're standing can influence your voting behavior, but that would be even more specific than that. Regardless, the idea is about location, not necessarily about whether it's proper or appropriate. Question 33, the passage suggests that most experts who hold the traditional view of voting behavior would say that the school funding initiative in the 2000 Arizona general election passed because the majority of voters. So let's remind ourselves about what the traditional view was. That's going to be in this paragraph starting in line 6. It says, political scientists usually assume that voting is based on rational and stable preferences. People possess core beliefs and they weigh costs and benefits when deciding how to vote. And then they give some examples. If we care about the environment, we'll vote for candidates who promise to protect natural resources. If we're concerned about healthcare, we'll support initiatives to make it more affordable. The point here being is that line 14, in the cognitive model of voting behavior, the kind of building that people vote in does not affect their behavior. In other words, their behavior is determined by their core beliefs and their stable preferences. So going back to the question, the people who hold that view, they would probably argue that school funding initiative passed is because something like they value education, or they care about the future of their kids, or that's something that aligns with their core beliefs. So that's the type of answer that we're looking for. Let's go through the choices. The majority of voters believe that the initiative accorded, that means agreed, with their reasoned views. So yeah, that makes sense. This language of according with their reasoned views is echoing the language over here that it's based on rational and stable preferences and that people have core beliefs. So again, that's generally how the SAT makes their questions. They basically just rephrase things that you've seen in the passage. Let's go through the other choices. Choice B, the voters cast ballots in venues with triggers that encourage them to favor the initiative. So again, according to the traditional view, the venue where you vote has nothing to do with your decision. Your decisions are based on your core values and your preferences, so B is out. Choice C, we're exposed primarily to arguments supporting the initiative. That could be the case. You might argue that, hey, if you are only aware of arguments supporting the initiative, you are going to support it. It's a little bit different from what the paragraph was saying before, because the paragraph is saying that you have a rational and stable preference. It almost implies that even if you're opposed to another argument or opposing arguments, your core beliefs are not going to change. So C is a little bit off. It's not as good as A, clearly. And choice D, that the majority of voters voted for the initiative due to geographic factors. So again, saying the exact opposite. B and D are saying really the same thing, and that's the opposite of what the traditional view believes. So all that means is that A is the best choice. Question 34, which choice best illustrates the view referred to in the answer to the previous question? So you don't actually have to do 33 and 34 together. Notice that unlike the typical paired questions, 34 is not asking for evidence or reasons to justify our answer choice in 33. 34 is basically saying which example that they're choosing best illustrates the view that's in the previous question. So real quick, let's look at the previous question. And we'll remind ourselves that the view in question 33 is the traditional view. And the traditional view is that voters voted because that thing agreed with their reasoned views. So you vote according to your view and according to your values. So now let's go through the answer choices. Choice A is lines 1 through 4. And it says, although geography clearly matters in voting, the East Coast leans Democrat, the South skews Republican. Few people would think that the exact venue in which they vote matters. Yeah, this is kind of going along with the traditional view that few people would think that the exact venue in which they vote matters. It's kind of saying it in a negative way. A could work, but there's probably going to be a better answer. Choice B, lines 11 through 13. If we're concerned about healthcare, we support initiatives to make it more affordable and available to a greater number of people. If we're looking for an illustration of the traditional view, right, it's said right over here that people vote based on their rational and stable preferences, choice B is going to be a better answer because here we're giving an example of healthcare. If you're concerned about healthcare, you'll vote for things that make it more affordable. So B looks like it's going to be a better answer than A. So we'll keep it for now. Choice C, 25 to 30. Start at 25, it says, schools are filled with lockers, desks, and chalkboards, which might remind people of children or early educational experiences, and once these thoughts are triggered, they might change behavior. Could voting in a school lead people to support educational funding? Certainly, this has nothing to do with the traditional view. This is actually explaining how the alternative view works, namely that people are influenced by the location. So C is definitely not going to be the answer. Choice D, lines 46 to 47. Let's look at it. Most people support education, but few people enjoy paying more taxes. So again, this has nothing to do with the traditional view of voting. It's not an example of it. This is basically just saying that this was going to be a hard decision. So all that means is that choice B is going to be the best answer for 34. Question 35, it says, the author most directly characterizes himself and his research team as, so characterize is the way that you describe yourself. Since we're not talking about anything specific, it's really hard to look back in the passage and try to guess what they're talking about, so we have to go through the answer choices first. Choice A, he and his research team were displeased with certain political efforts to manipulate how voters behave. Nothing in the passage about political efforts that aim to manipulate how voters behave. It seemed like this is just something that no one really thought of. And so that's what they were interested in finding out, whether a location can change how people behave. So A is going to be out. B, dissatisfied with the lack of general agreement on how voters think and act. So there was no indication that there was a lack of general agreement. If anything, it seemed like most people believed in the traditional view. They might have been the first people to actually challenge it. So B doesn't seem right. C, unconvinced by certain assumptions about how voters make decisions. Yeah, unconvinced was definitely the case. If we look at line 17, when it says we weren't so sure, what were they not so sure of? The whole previous paragraph talks about the traditional view that is based on rational and stable preferences. And then it says line 16, this is a reiteration. In this calculating cognitive model of voting behavior, the particular kind of building people happen to cast their ballot in should not affect behavior. But we were not so sure. In other words, we were not convinced that this was the truth. C looks like it's going to work. Choice D. They were alarmed by the strength of their findings regarding how easily voters can be influenced. It does seem that voters are very easily influenced based on the location, but were they alarmed? I'm going to say no, because there was no indication of that. Let's take a look real quick. When we looked at what the results were, what was their reaction? The passage actually doesn't say. They talk about what the results were from lines 51 to 54. So those were the results. And then what did they do? They said this difference persisted even after we controlled for things like regional differences. So they wanted to make sure that the results were real and not influenced by something else. So they did good work as scientists, but nothing in this paragraph or after talks about their own emotional reaction to it. So really the passage is silent on that, and C is going to be the best answer. Question 36, which choice best supports the idea that many voters felt deeply invested in the outcome of the vote on the school funding initiative? So to feel deeply invested in something implies that you put a lot of time or effort or even money into something. So basically it means that you care a lot about the outcome. A lot of times on the SAT, when you're going through different choices and seeing which one works, you want to try to simplify the question in your mind. So in my mind, the simplified question is which shows that people cared a lot. Keeping that in mind, let's look through the answer choices. Lines 41 to 44. So start right here. It says, in particular, we focused on a ballot initiative that proposed raising the sales tax from 5% to 5.6%. to support public schools. So does that sentence show that people cared about it? No, it's basically showing what the ballot was about. So A is going to be out. Choice B, 44 to 45. This initiative had been hotly debated with good arguments on both sides. So B is a potential answer, because to say that something had been hotly debated and there were good arguments on both sides does kind of support the idea that people were heavily invested in it, either emotionally, intellectually, possibly financially, because it involves sales tax. So we'll keep around B for now. 48 to 50, does it show that voters care? If where people voted didn't matter, then the percent supporting the initiative should be the same at schools and other polling locations. So this is one of the assumptions of the traditional view. Again, does not show how much people cared about the results as B does. So C is not going to work. 63 to 65, start right over here. A significantly higher percentage of the people who voted in schools were in favor of the increasing funding for schools. So this is just a statement about the results. Basically, it says people who voted in schools were more in favor of increasing the funding for the schools. Does not talk about how much people were invested in the issue. So all that means is that out of all the choices, B is going to be the best. Question 37, as used in line 54, dramatic most nearly means. So we can start at line 54. Polling locations had a dramatic impact on voting behavior. So dramatic is describing the impact. What was the impact? If you just quickly look above, it says more than 10,000 more people voted in favor of the school funding initiative when the polling place was in a school. So the location had a dramatic impact. What's a good word? A big impact in my mind, because big is talking about the fact that 10,000 more people voted just because they voted in a school. So big, huge, significant, it was important. So this is not dramatic as in someone's acting overly dramatic or emotional. We're talking about the size of the impact. So let's go through the answer choices. Dramatic impact. Theatrical, again, this would have more to do with drama as in acting or emotion, so not really going to work. It's not like big or significance. Abrupt means something happens all of a sudden or quickly or unexpectedly, so not the same as big. Striking is okay because if something's striking, it means that it catches your attention. And to say that the impact is striking is certainly true because it was big, because it was significant, because it was dramatic. Choice D, sensational. Now, sensational would probably be the closest answer. Sensational implies that something causes some type of reaction. To say that the impact was sensational, it meant that as a result there might have been a lot of public interest or excitement. So it kind of fits, but it's not exactly what the passage is saying. The passage wasn't really talking about the effect on other people of this result. It didn't go as far as saying what people's reaction about it was. So D is kind of the closest after choice C, but C is still better. Question 38, which statement best describes the function of the last paragraph in the context of the passage as a whole? So they're basically just asking, what is the point of the last paragraph? Let's look at it real quick again. It says, starting in line 68, a 10,000 vote difference might not seem like much, but it was more than enough to shift a close election. In the 2000 presidential election, the difference between George Bush and Al Gore came down to less than 1,000 votes. And then if 1,000 votes is enough to shift an election, 10,000 certainly could. So triggers matter. So if you remember when we were doing our annotations, my point was we're really talking about the significance of these findings, because you might think that 10,000 votes is a small number, but he's bringing up this example to say that, hey, 10,000 votes actually can make a difference. So let's look at the answer choices. 38. It addresses a potential criticism of the author's argument by providing a context in which that criticism should be understood. So this one is okay, because what would the potential criticism of the argument be? The criticism is what he says in the very first sentence. A 10,000 vote difference might not seem like much, because you could look at his whole study and say, okay, yeah, it's true. Like, of the people who voted in the school, 10,000 more voted for the school initiative or that thing that would help them. But hey, that's only 10,000. And so he's responding, or he's anticipating that criticism by saying, hey, look, here's an example where less than 10,000 votes did make a difference. So obviously we should care about 10,000 votes. So we'll keep around A. Choice B. It suggests that the author's findings may shed light on a phenomena in fields other than political science. The example that he gave in the last paragraph was the election. That's still political science, so it's definitely not fields other than political science. Choice C, it concedes is to admit. It concedes the existence of a significant exception to a trend identified by the author. Keep in mind that that example of the Florida election had nothing to do with the location or the physical location of the voting. The example he used of the Florida election in 2000 is simply there because he wants to demonstrate the significance of 10,000 or 1,000 voters. So if we identify the trend as in people vote based on their physical location, mentioning the Al Gore and Bush election had nothing to do with that. So choice B is going to be out. And even if you didn't think of that as the trend, that's not the purpose of mentioning that. The purpose, as we said, was just to say, hey, 1,000 votes, 10,000 votes make a difference. Choice D, it summarizes the argument that the author sought to overturn with his research. Given that the paragraph is talking about the significance of a small number of votes, number one, the author did not try to overturn that argument, meaning to say to show that it was wrong. It also had nothing to do with the author's original intention, which was to show that physical location had something to do with voting behavior. So really C and D are kind of just not related. All that means is that A is the best answer. Question 39, which statement best identifies a weakness in the author's claim in the last sentence? So what does he say in the very last sentence? Very simply, triggers matter. Now let's remind ourselves what triggers exactly are as the author defines them. So looking at line 23, it says different locations contain different triggers. Churches are filled with religious imagery, which might remind people of church doctrine. Schools are filled with lockers, desks, and chalkboards, which might remind people of children or early educational experiences. And once these thoughts are triggered, they might change behavior. So it looks to me like the triggers are the specific things that are in the locations, and the triggers activate thoughts, and that changes behavior. So let's keep that in mind. Now we're looking for something that identifies a weakness in the claim. And what is the claim? The claim is very simply that triggers matter. So choice A, the author restates the claim that triggers matter, but does so without having offered examples of triggers in the passage. The paragraph that we just looked at was given examples of triggers, so A is just not true. He does give examples. B, the author characterizes his claim about triggers as innovative, whereas the passage as a whole suggests that many other scholars offer similar explanations for voter decisions. So the passage as a whole nowhere said that other scholars offer similar explanations for voter decisions. Now, whether or not that's true, I don't know, but the passage never said it. So B is going to be out. Choice C, the author states that a trigger influenced a particular election, but fails to provide evidence for his claim elsewhere in the passage. So I would say the whole passage, or the passage as a whole, is about the evidence. The evidence is provided in his study. So the author does not fail to provide evidence. The evidence was in that one study. So C will be out. D, the author makes a general claim about the significance of triggers, but the passage provides evidence of only one instance of a trigger affecting voters' actions. So this is going to be a fair criticism because the passage itself focuses on one study, meaning to say the people who voted for that increase in tax, which helps schools, and them doing so in a school building. That is one instance, and yeah, he is making general claims about triggers. So D is probably going to be the best choice if we compared it to A, B, and C in terms of showing that this is a weakness. So to make his argument stronger, if he could find, or his whole team could find, other instances where that happened, then it would be much better. Question 40, the table most clearly indicates that which statement is true of voters who lived within 0.2 miles of a school and voted in a school. So this is the first time that you should be looking at the table. Let's take a look at it. Now, initially when I looked at this table, I thought it was very confusing, but one thing you want to keep in mind is that in the reading section, if it's showing you tables or if it's asking you anything about math or data interpretation, it's going to be a very simple question. You don't get really hard questions about looking at tables unless you're in the math section. So keeping that in mind, let's look at it. It says the whole table is the increased percentage likelihood of supporting school funding initiative when voting in a school. So keep in mind that all these groups, A, B, and C, were all voting in a school. What's the first group? Increased percentage likelihood for all voters. B, increased percentage likelihood for voters living within 0.2 miles of a school. Increased percentage likelihood for voters living within 0.4 miles of a school. And what you'll notice that the initial results were, there was an increase, 0.845, 0.583, 0.556. And then after they controlled for demographics, what the pastor talked about, each of these numbers did go down a little bit, but they still remain positive. So there still was an increased percentage of likelihood because of the fact that they voted in a school. I think that's the best way to interpret the data. Let's go back to the question. The question is asking, which is true of voters who lived within 0.2 miles and voted in a school? So we're focusing on this group in B. They went from 0.583 to 0.560. Let's see what the answers say. A, they supported the school funding initiative at a higher rate than voters who lived within 0.2 miles of a school and did not vote in a school. So keep in mind, we're comparing that group B with a group that's actually not shown in the table. Based on the fact that there was a 0.583 and a 0.56 increased likelihood, we can say that they supported the school funding at a higher rate than voters who did not vote in a school because that rate is simply there. In other words, any number that was there would back up choice A as long as it were positive. So A we're going to keep. B, they demonstrated no change in likelihood to support the school funding after researchers controlled for demographics. That's actually not true. There was a change. What was the change? It went from 0.583 to 0.560. So the increased likelihood decreased even though it was still there after they controlled for demographics. So that is a change. So B is going to be out. Choice C, They are more likely to support the school funding initiative than to support other initiatives in the election. We have no idea. This whole table is basically just talking about how likely these groups of people are to support the school funding initiative when voting in a school. It says nothing about any other issues. So C, we have no idea. It's going to be out. D, they accounted for a larger percentage of voters in the election than did any other group of voters. So again, the table is not saying how many of them were present compared to other voters. The table is simply talking about the increase in likelihood that they'd vote a certain way based on voting in school. So D, we also have no idea how many there were. So C and D, no idea. B, just false. C, true, based on the fact that the numbers are simply there and they're positive. So again, I mean, to me, it seems like initially when you look at it, it's very complicated, but given that it's the reading section, they're asking something very simple here. Question 41, based on the passage, the data in the last row and columns B and C of the table help the author and his team to do what? So let's look at the table real quick. They're focusing on the last row and columns B and C. So columns B is the people who lived within 0.2 miles of a school. Column C is the people who live within 0.4 miles of a school. And what does the last view or the last row show us? That for each of these groups, once they controlled for demographics, there was sort of a decrease in the likelihood that they would vote for that initiative. It went from 583 to 560, here 556 to 529. But as we said before, they were still more likely to vote for that initiative, probably because they voted in a school. And if you were to compare the differences, it looks like being closer to the school did have somewhat of a stronger effect than, living 0.4 miles from the school. So keeping that in mind, let's look at the answer choices. A, it helped identify additional examples of the roles of triggers. So no, because the whole table is just concerned with voting in a school. No other triggers were mentioned or looked at. A is going to be out. B, rule out alternatives to their explanation of voters' support for the school funding initiative. So yeah, when they say rule out alternatives, that's basically what they mean by controlling for demographics. In other words, these are other factors. The passage did mention that in lines 56 to 59, so we can take a look real quick. So it says, this difference persisted even after we controlled for things like regional differences in political preferences and demographics. Choice C show that the outcomes of multiple elections support their hypothesis about voters' behavior. So neither the table nor the passage talks about multiple elections. We only cared about that one election that they looked at, so C is out. D, explain why proximity to a school affected the decisions of people who did not vote in school. So this is what makes choice D wrong. The whole table is only talking about people who voted in a school. We have no idea what the people who did not vote in a school did, but they were not as likely as the people who voted in a school to support that school funding initiative. So D is going to be out also, and B is our best answer.